Welcome to Next Horizon Global, where we step beyond the headlines to understand the stories that shaped our world. So wherever you are, maybe at home with a cup of tea, take a deep breath and travel with us back in time, because what we call the Russia-Ukraine war is not just a conflict between two nations. It's the echo of 1,000 years of shared history, of faith, power, betrayal, and survival. It's the story of two civilizations that grew from the same roots but were pulled apart by the tides of empire. And it's the story of how every promise, every treaty, and every choice since then has led us to where we stand today. This is not about sides. It's about understanding how history itself becomes destiny. You're watching Russia-Ukraine Conflict, The Untold Story, Chapter 1, The Seeds of War. The war that didn't begin in 2022. It began long before, in promises made and broken, in treaties written with hope and erased by fear. It began in the shadows of empire, where history never truly ends. It only changes its name. To understand today's conflict, we must travel back, not decades, but centuries, to the moment when one river, one faith, and one city gave birth to two nations, and to a rivalry that would shape the fate of Europe itself. From one Kyiv, two destinies. Before the missiles, before the sanctions, before the trenches returned to Europe, there was only a city on the Dnieper River, Kyiv. In the 9th century, it became the heart of a vast federation known as Kyivan Rus, the first East Slavic state. Here, in 988 AD, Prince Volodymyr embraced Orthodox Christianity, binding his realm to the spiritual orbit of Byzantium. From that baptism emerged the cultural roots of both modern Russia and Ukraine, two nations that would one day dispute which one was the true heir of this legacy. When the Mongols swept through in the 13th century, Kyivan Rus collapsed. The northern lands rebuilt themselves around Moscow, while the western and southern regions fell under Polish-Lithuanian influence. Two civilizations grew from a common cradle, one imperial, one European. The seeds of future rivalry were already in the soil. In 1654, amid wars with Poland, the Cossack hetman Bohdan Khmelnytsky swore allegiance to the Russian Tsar through the Treaty of Pereyaslav. For Moscow, it was a homecoming, the reunification of brotherly peoples. For many Ukrainians, it was a desperate alliance that opened the door to domination. Over time, the partnership turned into absorption. By the 18th century, Catherine the Great had dismantled the autonomous Cossack hetmanate. Russian governors ruled in Kyiv. Language edicts banned Ukrainian publications, schools taught imperial Russian history, and poets were censored for patriotism. The policy was simple: to make Ukrainians forget they were distinct. The 20th century brought no reprieve. After the 1917 revolution, brief independence flickered out in civil war, and Ukraine was folded into the Soviet Union. Then came Holodomor, the famine of 1932-33. Stalin's forced collectivization stripped grain from the villages, millions starved. Kyiv remembers it as genocide. Moscow still calls it a tragedy of mismanagement. Either way, it scarred the national psyche. And in 1954, Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev transferred the Crimean Peninsula from the Russian SFSR to the Ukrainian SSR, a bureaucratic move inside one empire that would one day divide two nations. 4 decades later, the Soviet system began to crack from within. Mikhail Gorbachev's perestroika loosened censorship and exposed corruption. National movements revived across the republics, demanding freedom that could no longer be contained. In 1991, as the red flag came down over the Kremlin, Ukraine declared independence. Over 90% of citizens, including the majority in Crimea, voted yes. A nation that had been ruled from afar for centuries was finally free. But freedom arrived with chaos. Factories collapsed, savings evaporated, and GDP shrank by more than half. Amid the turmoil, Ukraine possessed an asset that terrified the world: 700 nuclear warheads. Through the Budapest Memorandum of 1994, Kyiv agreed to surrender them in exchange for assurances of sovereignty from the United States, the United Kingdom, and Russia. The signatories promised to respect Ukraine's borders and refrain from coercion. It was hailed as a triumph of diplomacy, a step toward a safer, post-nuclear world. Few realized that the word assurance was political, not legal. Ukraine had traded the ultimate deterrent for paper promises. 3 years later, the NATO-Russia Founding Act sought to preserve balance. NATO would expand, but pledged no permanent stationing of substantial combat forces in new member states. Russia accepted reluctantly, hoping consultation would replace confrontation. For a moment, Europe believed it had found equilibrium, a bridge between East and West. At the turn of the millennium, that fragile balance began to tilt. NATO's first post-Cold War enlargement brought Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic into the alliance in 1999. 5 years later came 7 more: the Baltic states, Romania, Bulgaria, Slovakia, and Slovenia. For Central Europe, joining NATO meant protection and a return to the Western family. For Russia, it was proof that the West had lied. Declassified U.S. archives show Secretary of State James Baker telling Soviet leader Gorbachev in 1990, "NATO's jurisdiction will not shift 1 inch eastward." Washington later argued that no written treaty bound them. But Moscow heard betrayal, not nuance. Television pundits in Russia warned that tanks once stationed in Germany could soon roll through the Baltics. The Kremlin felt encircled, a sentiment that would define its next 20 years of policy. Ukraine, meanwhile, drifted steadily toward Europe. It joined NATO's Partnership for Peace, hosted joint exercises, and sought closer trade ties with the EU. Public opinion was split. Western regions looked to Brussels, Eastern regions to Moscow, but the direction was set. The ghosts of past empires were beginning to stir. As the new millennium began, the battlefield of ideology gave way to a battlefield of energy. Ukraine's pipelines carried nearly 80% of Russia's gas exports to Europe. That steel network, inherited from the Soviet Union, made Kyiv both a gatekeeper and a hostage. In 2006, disputes over gas prices erupted. Moscow accused Ukraine of siphoning fuel. Kyiv said Russia was using energy as political blackmail. Gazprom shut off the valves. Overnight, millions across Europe lost heating in the dead of winter. 2 years later, it happened again. The 2009 gas crisis froze entire cities from Slovakia to Bulgaria. For the first time, Europeans realized that their warmth depended on Russian goodwill and Ukrainian stability. Editorials called it the energy weapon. In Berlin and Brussels, officials scrambled to diversify supplies. The result was the Nord Stream 1 pipeline, a 200-kilometer route under the Baltic Sea connecting Russia directly to Germany. To its architects, Nord Stream was a guarantee of stability; to its critics, a geopolitical trap. By bypassing Ukraine, Russia could punish Kyiv without punishing Europe. Energy had become leverage, not just trade. Gas flows became the new front lines of influence. At home, President Vladimir Putin, who rose to power in 1999, restored state control over energy giants and began reasserting Russia's global weight. His message was clear: Russia is back. In Kyiv, meanwhile, politics fractured. Corruption, oligarchs and shifting alliances left Ukraine unstable, vulnerable to pressure from both sides. The lines of dependency and distrust deepened, invisible but powerful, the pipelines of the future conflict. In 2004, Ukraine's streets filled with orange flags and chants for justice. The Orange Revolution was triggered by blatant election fraud favoring pro-Russian candidate Viktor Yanukovych. Tens of thousands camped for weeks in sub-zero temperatures. Western observers hailed a democratic awakening. Moscow saw Western-funded manipulation. Organizations like the National Endowment for Democracy, USAID, and Open Society foundations had indeed poured millions into civil society building, training journalists, election monitors, and activists. Their defenders called it democracy support. The Kremlin called it regime change. Eventually, a revote was held, and Viktor Yushchenko, the pro-European candidate, won. But the unity of the revolution soon dissolved into infighting, corruption, and disillusionment. The dream of a clean Western democracy began to fade, until history repeated itself. By 2010, Yanukovych was back, this time legitimately elected. He balanced between Moscow and Brussels, promising partnership with both. But by late 2013, when he abruptly rejected an EU association agreement under Russian pressure, the nation exploded once more. The Euromaidan movement began as a student protest, demanding integration with Europe. It grew into a national uprising, a revolt against corruption and Russian influence. As winter deepened, police cracked down. Dozens were killed on the streets. The world watched the images of Kyiv burning. In February 2014, Yanukovych fled to Russia. For Western media, this was a democratic victory. For Russian media, it was a Western-backed coup orchestrated by intelligence agencies and neo-nationalist militias. Both narratives took root, dividing not only Ukraine but the world's perception of it. In Moscow, alarm bells rang. Putin saw a pattern: revolutions spreading across the post-Soviet space, always ending with pro-Western governments. He called it the virus of color revolutions. The next move, he decided, would not be defensive. 2013, the economic tightrope and the war of narratives. Behind the politics, Ukraine's economy was a tightrope between East and West. Through the 1990s, GDP had fallen by more than 50%. Recovery began in 2000 but was derailed by the 2008 global financial crash. By 2013, Ukraine's public debt had soared past 40% of GDP. The government survived on IMF loans and European credit lines, but austerity demands hurt the public. At the same time, trade with Russia, once Ukraine's economic lifeline, kept shrinking. From more than 40% of exports in 2005, it dropped to around 30% by 2013. The European Union had become Kyiv's largest market. Economically, Ukraine was turning west even faster than politically. But as trade shifted, propaganda escalated. Western outlets framed the Maidan as a people's revolution against tyranny. Russian media portrayed it as fascist, funded by the CIA. Each side built a reality of its own. Between these competing truths, ordinary Ukrainians strived simply to survive inflation, corruption, and war fatigue. By 2013, wages had stagnated, energy bills soared, and the dream of EU integration, of joining a prosperous Europe, seemed like salvation. It was that dream, more than politics, that drew people to the Maidan. But as history would soon prove, dreams come with a price. 1994-2014, The Architecture of Broken Trust. Two documents defined the post-Cold War order, both written with optimism, both destined to fail. The Budapest Memorandum of 1994 assured that Ukraine's sovereignty would be respected if it gave up its nuclear weapons. The NATO-Russia Founding Act of 1997 promised cooperation and restraint, no permanent stationing of substantial combat forces in new member states. Neither was legally binding, both relied on faith. For 2 decades, leaders toasted those signatures as proof that Europe's divisions were healed. But beneath the speeches, suspicion grew. Russia accused NATO of inching closer each year. NATO accused Russia of weaponizing energy and intimidation. By 2014, those mutual accusations had hardened into reality. When Russian troops entered Crimea, Western officials called it the first armed redrawing of European borders since 1945. In Moscow, the move was defended as the correction of a historical mistake, the return of what was always Russian. The trust that once held the European order together was gone. The paper promises of the 1990s lay scattered like the rubble of the Berlin Wall they had once replaced. 2007-2014, the road to Crimea. The road to Crimea began long before 2014. In Munich 2007, Vladimir Putin stood before Western leaders and declared, "A unipolar world is not only unacceptable, it is impossible." It was a warning that Russia would no longer accept decisions made without it. A year later came the Bucharest summit of 2008. NATO's communiqué stated, "Ukraine and Georgia will become members of NATO." To Washington, it was a promise of inclusion. To Moscow, an existential threat. That same summer, Russia fought a brief war with Georgia, halting its NATO ambitions by force. In Brussels, the conflict was condemned as aggression. In the Kremlin, it was called defense, a precedent for what would come. Then came Libya 2011. Russia abstained from the UN vote to protect civilians, but NATO's airstrikes quickly toppled Gaddafi. For Moscow, this confirmed its fear: Western interventions disguised as humanitarian missions. In Syria 2013, Russia blocked another intervention, backing Bashar al-Assad and regaining Middle Eastern influence. Trust between Moscow and Washington evaporated. Against this backdrop, Ukraine's maiden uprising exploded. When President Yanukovych fled in 2014, Russia claimed that a Western-backed coup had toppled a legitimate government on its doorstep. Within weeks, unmarked troops, the so-called Little Green Men, seized airports and government buildings in Crimea. By March 18, 2014, the Kremlin announced that Crimea had voted to join Russia. The West called it an illegal annexation. Moscow called it self-determination. Sanctions followed. Diplomatic ties froze. For the first time since the Cold War, NATO redeployed forces to Eastern Europe. The world had entered a new age of confrontation, not declared but undeniable. The seeds of tomorrow's war. The world was told that the war began in 2022. But the truth is older. It lives in every decision that came before. It began with a shared faith on the banks of the Dnieper, when Kyivan Rus united the Slavic world. It deepened with the Treaty of Pereyaslav, when protection became subjugation. It hardened through centuries of empire, famine, and revolution. It re-emerged in the ruins of the Soviet Union, in treaties written with hope and broken by fear. Every promise that was made, every assurance that was reinterpreted, every pipeline that tied nations together also bound them to future conflict. The invasion of 2022 was not a lightning bolt from clear skies. It was thunder after years of gathering storms. Ukraine and Russia are more than neighbors. They are mirrors of each other's past and warnings of each other's future. One seeks freedom through Europe, the other seeks security through control. Between them lies the question that will define the 21st century. Can peace survive without trust? As we move into the next chapter, the battlefield shifts from geography to economics, from tanks to sanctions, from soldiers to alliances. The story continues with the world divided once again, not by walls, but by beliefs about power itself. The story continues. The story of this war does not end here. It only changes its battlefield. The fall of trust was only the first act. From the ashes of these broken promises rose a new kind of conflict, fought not only with weapons, but with currencies, sanctions, information, and alliances. A silent war shaping the future of nations and the balance of the world itself. In the next chapter, we uncover how this conflict spread far beyond Ukraine, into boardrooms, energy markets, and digital networks. How sanctions reshaped economies, how new blocs emerged from the East, and how the dream of a united Europe gave birth to a divided planet. The Untold Story continues. This is Chapter 2, The Proxy Battlefield, 2014-2025. If you found truth in this story, share it. Subscribe and join us as we continue revealing the events shaping tomorrow's world. This is Next Horizon Global, where truth meets perspective.